Good morning, and welcome to this installment of the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta's monthly webcast series. Today, we're going to be talking about nonprofits that provide scholarships and other financial assistance and how to set up those programs. We're excited to have with us today Ashley Halfman speaking to us about this topic. Before Ashley gets into the substance of the presentation, I wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about the Pro Bono Partnership of Atlanta. My name is Sarisha Ganta. I'm Counsel and Education Director with the partnership. And the mission of PBPA is to provide free legal assistance to community-based nonprofits. We do this by connecting nonprofits in the greater metro Atlanta area with attorneys from the leading corporations and law firms in the community. These attorneys help nonprofits with their business law matters. To be a client of PBPA, a nonprofit must be a 501c3 organization located in or serving the metro Atlanta area and assisting low-income or disadvantaged individuals. The nonprofit should also be otherwise unable to afford legal services. If you would like more information about PBPA or our client services, please visit our website, where you can also fill out a request for legal assistance. Also on our website, we have a wealth of resources, including articles, podcasts, and dates for future in-person events that we currently don't have on the calendar, but we hope to get started again soon. Today's webcast will also be shared in recorded form on our website in a few days. And some quick disclaimers. Just keep in mind that today's information is general guidelines. If you are looking for specific information for your organization, please reach out to an attorney. Today's information is copyrighted. And a quick note on the topic. The substance of today's topic is geared towards nonprofit organizations who are looking to create scholarships or financial assistance funds. It is not intended for individuals who are seeking financial assistance or scholarships. And with that, I will turn over the mic to Ashley, who is General Counsel at PrintPack and a fantastic volunteer for PBPA. Thanks, Ashley, for presenting today.
Thank you, Sarisha. Happy to be here. Appreciate the introduction. And I'm a longtime volunteer of Pro Bono Partnership. I think they do a great service and great work for the community, so I'm happy to contribute to that. So as Sarisha mentioned, we're going to talk this morning a little bit about nonprofits providing a scholarship or financial assistance. The agenda for this morning is I'll go through sort of structural and legal overview for different ways to provide that assistance. And then we'll talk a little bit about the difference between scholarships and financial assistance and what it might make sense for your organization to provide. And then finally, we'll go through some best practices for creating a program for scholarships or financial assistance and administering that program. So before we get into the structure and the legal piece of this, one question that we get a lot is what is the difference between a scholarship and financial assistance? And the basic difference is whether the award is going to be taxable. So scholarships are non-taxable to the recipient of the scholarship only if your organization follows the criteria that we're going to discuss in the upcoming hour here and makes the appropriate filings with the IRS. So just for reference, here are some of the main regulations that are applicable to providing scholarships. There are a couple other smaller ones as well, but these are kind of the meat of where a lot of the regulations that we're going to talk about today are coming from. So let's talk a little bit about the requirements for a scholarship. The first requirement is that the group of applicants that you're selecting from has to be sufficiently broad to be considered a charitable class. That's described as sufficiently large and indefinite. So what does that mean? It means that it can't benefit a small group of pre-selected or pre-named individuals. So some examples of a charitable class would be students at colleges and universities in Atlanta, high school students from low-income families in Georgia, female college students in the U.S., or high school seniors graduating in the top 10% of their class. Scholarships also must be awarded on an objective and non-discriminatory basis. So some examples of criteria that are considered objective and non-discriminatory include financial need, academic performance, performance on standardized tests, community involvement or extracurriculars, or recommendations from teachers or other people in the community. You can also include interviews of applicants to determine their character. That's also considered to be sufficiently non-discriminatory. And then thirdly, scholarships can't be awarded to insiders. So who is an insider? That would be an officer or manager of your organization, a member of the selection committee for the scholarship, any substantial contributor or donor to your organization or to the particular scholarship, certain government officials, or family members of any of the above individuals. All of those are considered insiders for purpose of scholarships, and we want to avoid conflicts by awarding scholarships to any of those types of individuals. When we talk about some of the taxation piece of this scholarship awarding, in order for a scholarship to be excluded from gross income, it has to be what's called a qualified scholarship under the Internal Revenue Code. And it has to be received by an individual who is a candidate for, a degree at, and it has to be used for study at an educational institution that's described in Section 170 of the Internal Revenue Code. And Section 170 basically just says an educational organization which normally maintains a regular faculty and curriculum and normally has a regularly enrolled body of students in attendance. So that's the definition under the code. The definition of a qualified scholarship is used for qualified tuition and related expenses at the type of institution that we just described. So qualified expenses, again, are sort of clearly set out. They would be tuition and required fees, books, supplies, and equipment. Something like room and board, for example, would not be considered qualified tuition. Now, as I'm sure most of you know, most 501c3 organizations are either considered a public charity or a private foundation. And so there are rules that are applicable specifically for public charities when we're talking about awarding scholarships. So let's talk about a few of those. Public charities awarding scholarships cannot have any member of the selection committee for the scholarship that can benefit in any way from choosing the recipients. So for example, if there's a gentleman on the scholarship committee, his son cannot be in the applicant pool for that scholarship. You can donate money to a 501c3 school as a public charity, and you can recommend that that school grant scholarships to certain applicants, but at the end of the day, the school has to have the final say on which students actually receive the scholarship. So you can't specifically earmark money for an individual student or a specific student. And you also have to ensure that any non-U.S. citizen who is a potential recipient of a scholarship is not on the published specifically designated national terrorism list. We have a link to that here, and that takes you to a search tool. So you can go there, you can type in the name of any non-U.S. citizen that would be an applicant or potential recipient of the scholarship, and make sure that they're not on this terrorism watch list, essentially. So with respect to private foundations, all of the rules that we just talked about on the last slide apply to private foundations in awarding scholarships, plus there are some additional rules that also apply to private foundations. One of those is if you give scholarships to selected students, you have to obtain the pre-approval of your selection procedure from the IRS by submitting a request for approval at least 45 days before you would make the first award of the scholarship. If you fund scholarships from programs at an educational institution and the grant is conditioned on certain students receiving scholarship funds, then the rules that apply to scholarship awards to selected students above also apply here. And if your foundation is affiliated with a business entity or company, and employees of the business or their children are eligible for scholarships, then the program has to strictly follow some additional rules in order for the funds to be non-taxable. And we'll talk about some of those rules in just a minute. But as you probably can tell from what we just discussed, the main difference between the requirements for private foundations excuse me, and public charities is pre-approval. So again, under the Internal Revenue Code, and this comes from Section 4945, private foundations have to obtain pre-approval from the IRS for their procedures for selecting recipients of scholarship grants in order to pay them out. Public charities are not required to obtain IRS pre-approval for their process, but public charities generally follow and look to the federal tax rules for private foundation scholarship grants when structuring their scholarship grant programs anyway, just to provide sort of an extra measure of protection.
Hey, Ashley, could I ask a quick question? And this is something that you already covered, but I just wanted to ask to kind of to reiterate. What's the difference between a scholarship, a grant, and a fund?
Well, so it's a little bit semantic. You know, as we've talked about, and we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, the best practice, if you're calling something a scholarship, is that it is actually non-taxable. And in order for that to be the case, you need to be following all of these, rules and regulations that we're discussing. So anything that's not called a scholarship, if it's called a grant or a fund or something like that, you don't necessarily need to be following these rules for a non-taxable organization. Some people think that, a scholarship should require meeting some levels of, of merit or excellence in terms of education criteria or something like that, but that's not actually necessary. So hopefully that helps answer the question.
It does. Thank you.
Okay, so a couple slides ago we talked about a situation where you're granting a scholarship and you're affiliated with a company, and you're granting a scholarship to employees or family members of that company. So in order for that type of scholarship to be non-taxable, there are additional requirements that need to be followed. One is that it's prohibited to use that scholarship as an inducement. So in other words, the scholarship program can't be used to recruit employees of the company It can't be used to continue their employment as an inducement to continue employment. And it can't represent compensation for past, current, or future services of the employee. There needs to be an independent selection committee. That selection committee needs to be totally independent from the employer. So former employees, for example, are not considered to be independent, and they should not serve on the committee for selecting a scholarship. There needs to be minimum eligibility requirements that are related to the purpose of the program. So you want to limit the selection committee to considering only those employee or children of employees who meet the minimum standards, say, for admission to a qualifying educational institution. And eligibility can't be related to other employment-related factors like someone's position or services or duties to the company. There needs to be an objective basis for selection. So the selection of the recipients has to be based solely on objective standards that are, again, completely unrelated to the employment of the recipients or their parents or to the employer's line of business. Eligibility can't be contingent upon continued employment. So you can't terminate a grant of a scholarship award because an employee is terminated after the scholarship is awarded, for example. There needs to be a course of study that's not limited to the areas that are of particular benefit to the company. So if it's an engineering company, you can't limit scholarships only to people interested in studying engineering. And then the scholarships and courses of study that are supported by the scholarships must also be consistent with a disinterested purpose of enabling recipients to get an education solely for their personal benefit. So if these conditions aren't met, then the IRS may consider the grant a taxable expenditure instead of a scholarship, and the foundation could potentially lose its exempt status. So if you're awarding scholarships to employees or employees' children, you need to be careful about following these requirements. Now, the next couple slides, I'm going to talk a little bit about scholarship rules for donor-advised funds. I don't know if anyone on the webinar today is part of a donor-advised fund, but a donor-advised fund is a separately identified fund or account that's maintained, operated, or legally controlled by a 501c3, and that 501c3 is generally referred to as the sponsoring organization. So for donor-advised funds, the donor can have advisory privileges over the distribution of funds from the donor-advised fund, but the sponsoring organization, so the 501c3, has to have actual legal control over the funds and the right to disregard the donor's advice. So the donor can say, hey, I think you should award these funds to XYZ, but at the end of the day, it must be true that the 501c3 has autonomy to decide how to award the funds. A donor can claim a charitable deduction for income tax, gift tax, or estate tax purposes if the donor obtains a written acknowledgement from the sponsoring organization, the 501c3, stating that it has the exclusive legal control over the assets that are contributed to the donor-advised fund. But when we're talking about awarding scholarships, the Internal Revenue Code section 4966, where all of this comes from, actually prohibits donor-advised funds from granting scholarships to individuals. And the only way that's allowed is if they fall into specific exceptions. So let's talk about that a little bit. The definition of donor-advised fund in the code does not include any fund which makes grants to individuals for travel, study, or other similar purposes if the fund is activated by committee of all of the members of which are appointed by the 501c3 sponsoring organization, The committee is not controlled by the donor or the donor advisor to the fund. And all grants from the fund are awarded on an objective and non-discriminatory basis pursuant to a procedure that's approved in advance by the governing board of the sponsoring organization, provided that that procedure has to meet the minimum requirements for private foundation grants. So this is a little confusing, but if a fund falls within the exception to the rule that you can't grant scholarships, the exception is the piece that we just talked about, then scholarship grants to individuals may be paid out of the fund without violating that general prohibition on donor-advised fund distributions to individuals. So this is a fairly technical area of IRC, Internal Revenue Code, and scholarship law. And if you do have a donor-advised fund and you have specific questions, then you probably should consult with an attorney on that. So some of the things we've talked about, rules and regulations around scholarships. Again, these all primarily come from the Internal Revenue Code. The other piece of having a scholarship, which is non-taxable to the recipient, is, of course, IRS filings then. So in addition to meeting any applicable requirements for your organization that we've already talked about, then, of course, you also need to do the proper filings with the IRS. And those include reporting information about your scholarships on Schedule H of Form 1023 and on Form 990. So on Form 1023 Schedule H, you have to provide information about the criteria used for selecting recipients, including rules of eligibility, how and by whom the recipients are or will be selected, and if awards will be made directly to individuals, whether information is required assuring that the individual student is remaining in school. If the awards are or will be made to recipients of a particular class, for example, children of employees of a particular employer, as we just talked about earlier. You need to provide information on whether any preference will be accorded to an applicant because of their parent's position or other employment factors, whether the recipient has to accept employment with the company upon graduation, and whether the award will be continued even if the employment ends. And you'll also need to include a copy of the scholarship application form and any brochures or literature that describe the scholarship program. For Form 990, if you're awarding scholarships to domestic individuals, and those are defined as people who live or reside in the U.S. at the time the scholarship is paid or distributed out to the individual, you will record information on Part 3 of Schedule 1 of Form 990, and you need to include information on the total number and amount of scholarship grants paid during the applicable tax year. And if you're awarding scholarships to foreign individuals, which is anyone, including a U.S. citizen or resident who is living or residing outside the U.S. at the time they receive the funds paid or distributed, that information goes on Part 3 of Schedule F of Form 990. And you'll do the same information, total number and amount of scholarship grants paid during the applicable tax year, but for this form, this schedule, you need to segregate those out by geographic region. So if you're awarding scholarships to people in different geographic areas, Europe, Asia, etc., you would need to separate them out by geographic region. Now, I probably should have provided this caveat at the beginning. I am not a tax attorney. I don't have any specific expertise in tax law, but this information is generally designed to help you at least know, hey, I've got some reporting obligations, and of course your accountant can help you figure out exactly what information you would need to be providing in your filings. So circling back to our first slide, what's the difference between scholarships and financial assistance? for purposes of our discussion today, what we're trying to illustrate is that, really the difference is nomenclature, but that nomenclature is based on whether or not you are following the rules and regulations to make something taxable or non-taxable to the recipient. So if you're following all of the rules, or you're able to follow all of the rules that apply to your organization that we've just talked about, and make the proper filings, then what you are awarding can properly legally be called a scholarship. If your organization is not able to meet all these requirements, or you just would prefer not to do that, because obviously they are very in-depth, then you might consider providing financial assistance instead. Some of the factors that you might want to consider are, what funds do you have available for use for the awards? And then what kind of financial and personnel resources do you have available to create or administer the program? Because obviously, following and complying with these regulations can be time-consuming, and it's also helpful to have people who are knowledgeable in this area. So if you're already providing awards and you're not complying with the applicable scholarship laws and regulations that we've discussed already, then you might want to consider calling your awards financial assistance rather than a scholarship.
And Ashley, before we go into best practices, could I ask a couple questions?
Sure.
First of all, this was a question that came in with the pre-registration. Is there a minimum dollar amount, either per year or per scholarship, required in order to get or keep an organization's 501c3 status?
Not to my knowledge, no. I don't think there's any minimum distribution, amount required.
Okay. And one of our audience members asked, do these IRS guidelines apply to foundations exclusively?
No. So that goes back a little bit to the, difference between a public charity or a private foundation. Again, pretty much all 501c3s fall into one or the other of those categories, and so you probably know which yours is. But we talked a little bit earlier in the slides about some rules that are applicable specifically to public charities, and then for private foundations, all those rules plus additional rules are applicable. So if you go back and sort of look through those slides, you'll be able to see which apply to foundations and which apply to charities.
And Elena is asking a question, I'm not sure if we have the answer, but are there any special rules or exemptions of these rules that apply to churches?
I guess I don't know specifically. Typically, a church, it falls into the public charity side as opposed to a private foundation. So if your church has a 501c3 and it is a public charity, then the rules that apply to public charities would, for scholarships would apply to you. Beyond that, I don't know if there are specific rules that are applicable just to churches. I haven't seen anything like that. But again, you might want to, consult an attorney just to make sure.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well, Ashley.
Okay.
And that's all the questions for now.
Okay. Well, we'll keep rolling then. The last part of the program is talking about best practices. And so whether you decide to do, call it financial assistance, and you're not going to pursue it being non-taxable to the recipient, or you decide to pursue a scholarship program and make sure that is taxable to, or is non-taxable to the recipient, then there's best practices that apply sort of in all of these situations. The first thing you're going to want to do is to look at the governing documents for your entity. So bylaws, articles of incorporation, and make sure that the purpose clause in these documents allows scholarships to be offered as a permissible, permissible function of the organization. So the mission or the purpose clause doesn't have to specifically state that you can provide scholarships, but you just want to make sure that there's not anything in those clauses that would be contradictory, that would say, seem to indicate that you shouldn't be providing scholarships. Then you're going to want to think about applications for the scholarship program. You want to start probably with creating forms to make it simpler, make the process easier. You want to design the application to reflect the organization's selection criteria and collect the information that the organization needs to choose recipients. You can include an area on the form if you want to for office use only, where the organization can add scoring information or other identity information as the application goes through the process. And just thinking about creating forms, we'll talk a little bit in a minute about criteria for the scholarship and for your organization. And again, you want to make sure that the application clearly reflects those criteria. It's a good idea to try to standardize deadlines so that all of the applicants and all of the folks in your organization are on the same page about what has to be done by what date, when applications have to be completed, when applications will be reviewed by the committee or whomever in the organization is performing the review, and when potential awards will be made to recipients. You shouldn't charge fees for this scholarship application, and you need to be careful not to collect Social Security numbers. I'm sure everybody's aware these days there's a lot of heightened requirements around people's personally identifiable information. So if you can go through the process without collecting a Social Security number, that's definitely preferable, because then you don't have to worry about additional regulations around how you protect that information and keep it safeguarded. And then finally, just make sure to proofread the application or any other documents before you publish them out into the world. For selection criteria, you want to try to be as specific as possible. So a good way to do that is to try to identify the objectives that your organization has with awarding the scholarship, and then relate those objectives to concrete criteria. So if your organization has an objective to, help provide education to create more, rural healthcare providers, then you might want to specifically tie some concrete criteria to that. People who are interested in or studying medicine, people who have high GPA in sciences, people who have volunteer experience in healthcare or in rural communities. And then you want to try to limit subjective criteria. So things like essays and other types of things that would be considered more subjective. You can still have them, but it's best to limit them and try to focus as much as possible on the subjective criteria, because, again, remembering back to the beginning of the presentation, we want to make sure that scholarships are awarded on a non-discriminatory basis, an objective and non-discriminatory basis. And then creating and reviewing a scoring process is also very important. So you want to make sure that within the organization you have a very clear path set forth to how you're going to review these applicants, how you're going to score them, and ultimately how you're going to decide, to whom the scholarships or the financial assistance are awarded. Then communicating with your applicants, potential recipients and recipients. Of course, these days the best way to to publicize, to get information across is obviously using technology. So if you have a website, posting information on the scholarship on your website, or there's of course multiple databases across the country that deal with scholarships, and you can post information about your scholarship or your financial assistance in any of those websites. When you're talking about creating application forms and materials, you want to try to make it as easy as possible for your applicants, and so having online forms and online materials that they can access obviously makes it convenient for them. And then sending acknowledgments or communicating with them through email or even text is obviously also very convenient. The one caveat there is when you're dealing with anything online, you have to be cognizant of privacy protections and make sure that you have sufficient privacy protections in place, along with requirements that are needed for electronic signatures. So if you're asking the applicant to electronically sign their application or something, then you need to have sort of the magic language in the application that allows electronic signatures by both parties. When you get to the exciting point of actually awarding the money, you want to provide an award agreement that's signed by both parties, both the recipient and your organization. And you want to make sure that any and all terms and conditions that apply to the award are set forth very clearly in that document so that the recipient knows exactly what is required or expected of them. So you would want to, at a minimum, set forth the amount of the scholarship or the financial assistance and the term of that. If there is a term and it's renewable, for example, then what are the conditions for renewing the scholarship? How's it going to be paid? And we'll talk about in a minute paying to the individual versus paying directly to the educational institution. You want to talk about any conditions that would require repayment. So if the recipient does something that, particularly in a case of a non-taxable scholarship, they don't follow some of the rules that are required for it to be non-taxable, then they're required to repay that money under the Internal Revenue Code. So you would need to include information about that. And then, again, if it is an actual scholarship that's non-taxable, reporting obligations or tax obligations of the recipient, if any. If it is taxable to the recipient, then you would want to discuss tax obligations and make sure that the recipient is aware that, hey, you're going to have to pay taxes on this amount. So talking about payment of funds, as I just mentioned, for scholarships, which are, again, to be non-taxable to the recipient, the best practice is always to pay the money to the educational institution directly. If funds are paid to the recipient directly, which you can do, then they have to verify that the money is spent on tuition, fees, or supplies that are allowed to keep the award non-taxable, and that requires an additional amount of record keeping on both your part and the student's part, the recipient's part. So it's always simplest and most straightforward if you have the ability to, for a scholarship, to provide the funds directly to the educational institution. If you're not, trying to meet the non-taxability requirements and you're calling it financial assistance, then you can pay directly to the recipient. Now, after your program is up and running, one of the best practices that we recommend is to evaluate the effectiveness of your program. So you want to try to track and evaluate measurable outcomes that are a result of your program. A good way to do this would be retention or graduation rates, other awards that are received by your recipients besides the scholarships or the financial assistance that you're providing, the average debt of recipients of your award at graduation, or enrollment in graduate and professional schools after graduation. And I'm sure there's other measures as well, but having something in place where you have specific, objectives or criteria, you want to sort of try to tie outcomes, measurable outcomes from your scholarship program to those criteria. Also important, best practice is documentation and record keeping, which everyone loves to do, but we got to do it. So if you haven't already, when you're starting out, setting up a scholarship program, if you haven't already done this for your organization as a whole, it's a good idea to establish record keeping processes. If you have record keeping processes already in place, you might want to review them just to make sure that what you're doing with this scholarship or financial assistance program can be incorporated into that in terms of record keeping. And it's a good idea to keep records related to scholarships or financial assistance for a minimum of 3 years. You want to maintain records with respect to the program on the overall processes and procedures of the program, including the types, purposes, and amounts of the grants, the money that you're going to be awarding, how the scholarship grants are publicized. So if you're putting them on your website or you're putting them on different scholarship databases, you want to keep records of that. Clear records of the eligibility and selection criteria for the grants, the composition of the selection committee, specific documentation about each year's process. So as you go through this, the award process each year, you want to specifically document the selection committee met on these dates, and here's what we discussed, and here's how we followed our internal process of review and award of the scholarship. You also, of course, want to keep copies of all applications, and that applies even to applications for those who don't receive awards or grants from you. And you want to maintain signed copies of all the award agreements with the ultimate recipients of the money. And then finally, the procedures that are used to supervise the use of the scholarship funds. So again, once they're awarded, what processes and procedures do you have in place, around how the recipients are using the funds? And then finally, managing your program. So we've talked about a lot of requirements for scholarships, non-taxable awards. We've talked about a lot of best practices for awarding any type of financial assistance. There's a lot of processes, procedures, regulations, requirements. There's a lot of administrative pieces to this. So if possible, the best practice is to, at a minimum, assign specific personnel internally who are responsible for managing or administering the scholarship or financial assistance program, and making sure that you've established internal procedures around that. One really good resource is the National Scholarship Providers Association. You can visit their website, and they have all kinds of resources. They have toolkits related to setting up scholarship funds or financial assistance funds, managing scholarship funds. And you can also outsource scholarship management. They have organizations that are specifically set up for this purpose. So you can sort of, hire, pay an outside administrator through this organization. That obviously will eliminate some of the burdens on your organization of taking on that task internally, and potentially can limit costs. It can also avoid the possibility of actual or perceived conflicts. And as we talked about earlier, especially with, potentially with programs that award funds to employees or children of employees. That might be a benefit to avoid perceived conflicts. And it can help provide assistance with outreach, so they have a wider net to cast in terms of their platforms for publishing and making available information about your financial assistance programs. So I know that was a lot of material. I can see in the chat that we've had some additional questions. I guess, Sarisha, do you want to fire those at me?
Well, one of the questions was we might need a little more clarification from the Ms. Hopkins who presented the question, but she was asking about, it sounds as if the bulk of your presentation is related to scholarships being provided to students in a school. Are these same conditions or regulations applicable to scholarships offered to participants in a leadership program that are housed within the nonprofit organization? For example, they provide a scholarship to participants for their leadership program. Should this still be called a scholarship, or should it be called something else?
Okay, so
and I did follow up to see if there was a fee associated with this leadership program or not, or is it only by invitation?
And what was the answer to that?
I didn't get a response.
Okay.
But I think it's contingent on whether or not there's a fee, right?
That's part of it. I think, though, I suppose there could be a scenario where so it's a scholarship that's provided to a leadership program. And I'm sorry, did you say the leadership program is a part of what? Just a nonprofit organization?
The nonprofit organization.
Okay.
Yeah, itself. Mm-hmm. And there is a tuition fee, generally.
Yeah. So that would not be. I think it would still be. The rules would still be applicable if you're trying to present this as a scholarship. So in other words, if the nonprofit is calling it a scholarship and you're wanting it to be non-taxable to the recipient, then I think you still need to follow the rules for scholarships. So, yeah, I mean, you could either not call it a scholarship if you're, if you're not meeting those requirements, and just call it, an award or a grant or something like that. Or if you can meet the requisite requirements, then I think it could be non-taxable. I suppose, though, again, I'm not an expert, a tax expert, so it would probably be good to, specifically consult with an attorney about that.
Okay, thank you for that. And then we have one last question. Could you speak a little bit more about whether or not there are IRS reporting requirements for financial assistance?
Well, so theoretically, again, I'm not a tax expert, but from my understanding, every nonprofit, every 501c3 is required to file a Form 990 each year, right? So I believe that what you're supposed to do is to list any new activities that the organization is doing. So even if you're providing only financial assistance and not scholarships, you're not intending for them to be non-taxable, I think you would still want to provide information that you are engaging in that new activity of providing the financial assistance. But again, sorry, not a tax expert. So I would say, you would want to consult with your accountant or your attorney about that. But you don't have to provide specific information about that related to starting the scholarship, awarding the scholarships through Form 1023 Schedule H, as you would if you were attempting to, start up a scholarship program and wanted that to be non-taxable.
Thank you, Ashley. My internet connection dropped out, and I'm not sure
You're back on.
what happened or where I was cut off.
You're back.
Okay, good. And as far as I see, that is all the questions that I've seen. I thank you, Ashley, for presenting this information to us. It was very helpful. We really appreciate it. And to the nonprofits who are attending today, thank you for joining us, and thank you for all the great work that you continue to do in the community. And that's all for us today. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.